Gentlemen, it's not even my birthday and it's already the best day of the year. Today on the docket we're going to add the other half of the ass to the half-assed installation of our Kawasaki shock on our SV650 here. And that means we get to use a whole raft of specialty tools, including three of my favorites. We get to use the headlift stand, we get to use the engine crane, you can see it there, and best of all, we get to use a grinder. Let's get after this. In case you missed our first couple of episodes of Used Bike Rehab, the problem we're addressing is twofold. This shock is off of a Kawasaki of some sort, maybe a ZX-10, and it has this gas reservoir that the stock SV650 shock doesn't have. And that reservoir fouls on the battery and this mounting tab for the seat that you can see right here. And so we need to trim this and move the battery back in the bike a little bit so that the reservoir doesn't foul on either of those things. And that will allow the shock to move as it wants to and work correctly, but it also means that we won't be damaging this reservoir, which is already, it's got some interesting damage there from this, and just allow things to work correctly. So we need to unbolt the shock from its mount here, move it back this way a little bit, and get it in here with a grinder and recess this tab just a little bit. We also need to make sure that the battery is secured back away from it so that it doesn't rub on this reservoir either. And if you look in here, and you're gonna have to take my word for this, there's a mark on the battery right about here where it's been rubbing. So we need to remedy those two issues so that the shock doesn't rub on anything while the bike is moving. And that's what we gotta do today. But in order to do that, we need to lift the bike by something other than the swing arm, because we need to take the weight off of the shock itself so we can unbolt it here and move it back. And that means we need to lift by this tail section. There's a subframe, you can see part of it here. There's another portion of it where it anchors right here that is a structural member that supports the weight of the rider and should be sturdy enough to hold up the bike. That's not how the bike is really intended to be lifted, and so there's no obvious mechanism for doing that. But we're gonna make this work anyway. I was all set to get out my big boy angle grinder and go to town on this, but that felt, when I got down to looking at it, kind of like cutting fine wooden pieces with a chainsaw, and I'm not about that. So instead, I'm gonna use my Dremel here, the grinding bit that is unfortunately clogged up with aluminum. Hopefully this will work okay, to grind this tab, and then we're going to have to make similar grinds on the plastic seat tab itself. But we'll start with this right here. One additional thing that we need to do before we can reassemble everything is I've gotten these longer bolts to replace the bolts that go right here and support this battery tray. As you can see, that totally fouls on the shock, and that's totally not going to work. So we need to recess it down to about here. This is a pretty common solution to this problem in the SV650 owner community, apparently. But the problem is, when we pull this down, the bolt hole, which is right here, no longer lines up with this hole in the plastic. So if we stick the bolt through, you'll see it goes into the hole cockeyed. And that means we need the hole to be more down here. So we need to ovalize this hole somehow. We're gonna have to do the corresponding thing on the other side. And for that, once again, we're going to use our friend the Dremel. Let's put our battery back in. You can see that currently it kind of flops around in there. As I reassembled this, I decided that there's one more modification I want to make, if I can, and that's to this piece right here. You'll see that the battery tray touches that when we lower it away from the shock absorber so that it won't rub there. And this here is about where we want to position this once everything's assembled. So it would be nice to have an additional ½ inch or so of space between this and this piece. So what we're going to do is we're going to remove this from the swing arm and trim the top ½ inch or so off of there so that there will be some clearance between this and that way this doesn't influence our shock travel and mess up our spring rate. Alright, through the magic of post-production, I've omitted the art of the process where I shouted profanity at this piece until it reattached itself on its own. If that doesn't work for you, this is the tool I would recommend. Subtle hand. Anyway, now we're ready to put our bolts in to support this piece. But what we want to do is cut a piece of hose about this long to stick over the bolt so that when it's in there, this piece is mounted firmly and doesn't wiggle around like this. Bike back on its wheels, we can see that if I sit on this, there's still some clearance between right here and also there's just a hair of daylight between the battery and the reservoir there. So I think that's probably okay. We're gonna ride it a little bit and check it out and make sure that that's okay, but I think now we're good to go. Well guys, thanks for coming along on this journey. We're rapidly crossing items off of our to-do list for this bike. And now pretty much the only outstanding item I can think of is the gauge cluster and I guess tires. The tires it has are definitely worn and should be replaced, but they're still serviceable, so I'm gonna ride it around for a couple of weeks and see how I like the bike before I go and try to find tires for it. But as you can see here, we've got just the narrowest hair of daylight between the battery and the reservoir. And the narrowest hair of daylight is good enough, given that this pivots that way, away from the battery. And we've also got plenty of clearance now between our reservoir and the seat tab. So, with that out of the way, I think we're done for the day. Maybe time to take the bike for a little ride. So, if you came here looking for some mechanical advice, I hope you found it, and that it helped you. And if you came here looking to be entertained, I hope my rambling entertained you. And I will see you in the next one.